Venezuela remains in crisis after a hotly contested vote on a constituent assembly and ongoing violence between government and opposition forces, while the country is mired in a deep economic crisis. We speak to author and professor George Ciccariello-Maher.
Venezuela finds itself currently in a deep and prolonged economic, social, political, and institutional crisis, and is seeking some kind of solution and some kind of exit. The Constituent Assembly was posed as the possibility of an exit. This has been rejected by the opposition, which has threatened to continue protests in the streets.
On Tuesday, the UN Human Rights Office said Venezuelan security forces have wielded excessive force to suppress protests, killing dozens, and have arbitrarily detained 5,000 people since April. In preliminary findings based on 135 interviews conducted remotely and in Panama, it said it investigated 124 deaths and found 46 attributable to security forces, 27 to pro-government armed forces, with the rest unclear.
So I don't think anyone has said at any point that the government wasn't responsible for deaths in the streets and that these deaths no one should be held responsible for these. There have been cases in which police have been arrested very quickly, surprisingly quickly, for acting with excessive force. And yet we do know, of course, that the government's responsible for some deaths in these what are really battles in the streets. But I call them battles quite consciously because what you're seeing is people being killed on both sides. And what's strange about this UN report is that it finds very decisively the cause of death for half of these deaths that have occurred in Venezuela, attributes these entirely to government and pro-government forces, and then doesn't comment on the remainder of the deaths. And actually what you see when you look at other sources is almost a sort of mirror image. In other words, those in which cause of death is determined are, very heavily on the side of Chavismo. In other words, Chavistas being killed.
On Monday, Venezuela's opposition said it was the government's fault. People within the military and beyond think the current political crisis should be, quote, escalated to an armed conflict. The first vice president of the opposition-led Freddy Guevara said the armed conflict would lead to more bloodshed.
The fact that in Venezuela there are Venezuelan military who are thinking that the conflict should be escalated to an armed conflict, even though there have been considerable falling in the current political conflict. There have already been more than 120 people killed in the armed conflict. There would be a substantial exponentiation of this. That there are Venezuelans and Venezuelan military that are thinking this. It is the complete responsibility of the dictatorship.
This is the same Freddy Guevara who is calling people into the street, calling people to essentially engage in combat against a government that he deems a dictatorship with, of course, no grounding in reality. And what's interesting about these claims coming from the opposition is that they drape themselves in the language of the Constitution, and yet they themselves urge military intervention. So if you look at the consultation that was carried out by the Venezuelan opposition, this sort of informal plebiscite, which was carried out outside of the auspices of any recognized institution, and after which these ballots were burned to destroy any evidence of whether their count was accurate or not. One of the questions asked about whether or not people felt that the military should intervene to defend the National Assembly. This is a clear call for military intervention to take sides in a institutional crisis, and a suggestion that the Constitution lay on the side of one branch of government rather than all three. So this is very troubling indeed, and this consultation also called for the establishment of a national unity government with no constitutional basis whatsoever. So the opposition uses this language of defending the Constitution, which, by the way, is a constitution that they themselves opposed ferociously when it was being written and approved by the majority of Venezuelans.
The dismissal of Attorney General Luisa Ortega has raised alarm bells in many quarters, as critics argue this move proves the Constitutional Assembly represents a usurpation of all political power in Venezuela and definitive sidelining of the legislature, the National Assembly.
I think these things are complicated. People have different understandings of what should and can happen within this Bolivarian process. This is nothing new. This happens during periods of heightened tension around 2006 and 2007 when there was a previous constitutional reform attempt. Some high-profile Chavistas left the ranks. 1999 to the year 2000, when Chavismo, as a much more moderate and reformist project, gave way to something a little more radical, and many people left. This happens. These debates are complicated and fraught and tense, But we need to understand that, that these kind of things happen, and people have different visions of what, of what should happen, and of what the proper path is forward. There are, for example, disagreements over the legality of the calling of the Constituent Assembly. I don't think that's a closed question, but it's certainly not closed in the sense that the international media would have us believe that to call the Constituent Assembly elections was a constitutional overstep. There's complete disagreement about what Articles 347 and 348 of the Venezuelan Constitution mean when it comes to how you convoke a Constituent Assembly. But these kind of debates exist within Chavismo. There's always been, and this is really the key point, there's always been a sharp debate. There have always been dynamics and tensions and conflicts between very different sectors, more sort of centrist reformist sectors, military sectors, far left revolutionary and communist sectors, the grassroots sectors, and the sort of leadership of the party and of the state. And these are always difficult conflicts and always difficult tensions. But this is precisely part of what makes Chavismo such an important force historically. Not that there are no debates, but that these debates have emerged in such a dynamic way.
Opposition writer Emiliana Duarte wrote about a recent visit to a Constituent Assembly polling station. She wrote that she had gone there, quote, thinking I'd see a gaggle of coerced slaves being frog-marched into an election, each of them secretly loathed as much as I do. But that's not what I saw, she wrote. Baffling though as it is to us, there are still millions of Chavistas who are genuinely, intimately excited to vote in support of the Constituent Assembly.
I mean, it's good to see the opposition recognizing this reality that they've been blind to for so long, namely the fact that Chavismo has been historically an immensely popular force. More than 10 years ago, when Chavez won 2/3 of the votes in the 2006 election, a huge landslide majority, opposition, leaders deemed this a fraud because it didn't feel right to them, because their neighbors all voted against him, because the entire feeling in their wealthy and light-skinned upper-class Caracas neighborhoods was that no one was voting for Chavez. Therefore, there must be a fraud. And so it shows that the opposition has been historically out of touch with the reality, and the fact that they can still remain out of touch. And the fact that they can be surprised that there are millions of Chavistas, even deep in an economic crisis, really shows their inability to grasp the function of Chavismo, the popularity of Chavismo, what it has meant for millions of Venezuelans. But the fact that, you could simultaneously be so utterly condescending, you can say, well, I'm surprised that people love Chavismo and are voting for it and are excited to vote for it. They clearly must not know what they're voting for. You know what? Poor people and people that don't look the same as you and have darker skin and who talk differently, they're entirely capable of knowing what it is that you're voting for. And they're certainly capable of knowing what it is that they're not voting for and what they're opposed to, namely the historic, neoliberal brutality of the Venezuelan opposition, the fact that this is just below the surface, and the fact that if we're talking about the Constituent Assembly vote, that many people were voting against this wave of protests in the streets.
We also got a response to recent sanctions imposed by the United States.
We're very, very troubled by what we're seeing unfold following the Constituent Assembly vote, which went about as we expected. But the rearrest of opposition leaders last night is very alarming. This could lead to an outbreak of further violence in the country. The situation from a humanitarian standpoint is already becoming dire. We are evaluating all of our policy options as to what can we do to create a change of conditions where either Maduro decides he doesn't have a future and wants to leave of his own accord, or we can return the government processes back to their constitution.
The United States government in general has absolutely no moral authority to say a goddamn word when it comes to the Venezuelan government or Nicolas Maduro, and especially not the government of Donald Trump. In other words, someone who, aside from being a sort of brutal xenophobe and misogynist, was also himself elected on the basis of voter disenfranchisement, primarily of black and brown people in the United States. So we're not on the terrain of moral criticism when it comes to what the Trump regime wants. We're on the terrain of realpolitik and the attempt to get rid of this Venezuelan government as quickly as possible, which has been a continuous policy, not only of Trump, but also of Obama, of Hillary Clinton at the State Department, and of George W. Bush. So this is nothing new. They want to get rid of Chavismo. They think that they can do it now. They've got to know, however, that these kind of sanctions don't help even that strategic goal, because to be opposed by Trump is is a mark of honor for anyone at this point, and certainly for Nicolas Maduro. If Trump is against you, then it means you must be doing something right. And so this isn't going to play out the way that the U.S. government wants, but they're just simply trying to talk tough to show some support for the Venezuelan opposition, while behind the scenes they help to escalate this conflict to a crisis point.
For all of our coverage on the ongoing crisis in Venezuela, go to therealnews.com. This is Jessel Noor.